Yo, what's up guys? Before we start today's video, I want to give a quick shout out to the guys over at High Fashion Talk for letting me promote my last video in that group. So for those of you who don't know, High Fashion Talk is actually a Facebook group whereby people who are into high fashion and fashion in general come together, and there are a lot of interesting discussions about certain topics in the fashion world. In my last video, I mentioned I'm trying to learn more about high fashion, and this is one of the ways that I'm doing that. So I'll leave the link in the description below. If you guys want to learn more about high fashion and fashion in general, it's really a great resource. So yeah, let's get into the video. What is up you guys, and welcome back to my channel. I hope that wherever you are in the world, you're doing well and staying safe. If you're new here, my name is Richard, and every week I make videos about men's fashion, streetwear, and sneakers. So if that sounds like the kind of content you want to watch, make sure you hit the subscribe button down below. Now, welcome to episode 3 of Fashion Normie Discussions. So if you guys watched last week's video, we talked about Noah or Noah NYC, and this week we're going to be talking about another New York-based streetwear brand, which is Aime Leon Dore, but it's pretty hard to pronounce, so I'm just going to be calling it ALD for the rest of this video. Now, don't worry guys, this video isn't going to be like 27 minutes long like the last video, because I don't really think there's as much to talk about with ALD as there was with Noah. But I think it's very fitting that we are going to talk about ALD today, because ALD's flagship store is really near Noah's flagship store. In fact, they're on the same street, which is Mulberry Street. And they're similar in more ways than one, but I'll get into that later. So I'm sure everyone knows ALD from the New Balance collabs, but in today's video, we're gonna dive in and explore the brand in a more in-depth fashion. So first up, as always, let's talk about a brief history of ALD. So ALD was actually started by Teddy Santis in 2014, and he was born and raised in Queens, New York. But he was also raised in a Greek household because I believe his parents are Greek immigrants. Now the story about how ALD started is actually a bit fuzzy. Now I did read from one source that Santis got the idea to start ALD because subway line construction kind of threatened to close his family's Greek diner, which he used to work at. But once again, I've only read it from one source, so I'm not sure about that. But the other story which I've read on multiple sources talks about how Santis used to do advertising and marketing for this boutique eyewear store while he still worked at his family's diner. So I guess this sort of got him more into the fashion world and sort of planted the seed of this idea in his head. And fun fact, in 2012, Santis actually designed the rough logo for the brand he wanted to create and screen printed it on his sweatshirt. And Ronnie Fike actually showed it on his Instagram because Ronnie Fike was Santis' friend. And if you guys didn't know who Ronnie Fike is, he's actually the guy behind Kith. It sort of blew up. So I guess that showed Santis that there was actually a demand for his brand. So I guess that may have pushed him to really take it seriously. And 2 years later in 2014, he started his brand. So another interesting fact about ALD, it was actually supposed to initially just be called Aime, which means loved in French, I believe. But he couldn't trademark that because obviously you can't trademark a work that's used so commonly in everyday speech. So he decided to incorporate the word Leon, which was his father's nickname, and Dore, which is the last syllable of his first name, which is Theodore. Now that we've gone over a few basic facts and a little bit of a history about ALD, let's jump into some of the aesthetic influences. So ALD is actually really influenced by the street culture and streetwear scene of New York. So Santis actually recalls a lot about his youth, similar to Barradeen from Noah. But I believe that Barradeen and Santis' childhoods were very different because Barradeen grew up in Long Island and Santis grew up in Queens, New York. So he talks a lot about how streetwear and street culture was a really big part of his childhood. So for example, when he used to play games of pickup basketball, he would talk about how people weren't allowed to play with them if they weren't wearing like nice clothes or they didn't dress well, which is a really strange concept to me, but nah, I guess that's New York for you. And he also talked about how it was actually quite important to look good on the court because obviously when you're playing on a street basketball court, there aren't any locker rooms or changing rooms. So he would talk about how a lot of times him and his friends would go and play basketball, and immediately after that they'll go hang out with other friends or they go to parties, so they always have to look fresh and sharp. So Santis talks a lot about the influence of music as well, and obviously any teenager listens to music to a certain extent on a certain level. And Santis was no different. Back then, of course, you had the East Coast hip-hop scene, people like Nas, Notorious B.I.G. And I think what's interesting is obviously this hip-hop scene, of course, influenced the streetwear and street culture of New York at the time. So we can really see how all of these influences intertwined together and played a huge role in Santis' childhood in defining it. So keeping all of these influences in mind, Santis says that he was really inspired by Polo Ralph Lauren. Not in terms of their clothes specifically, but in terms of the fact that they seem to manage to create their own world and their own sort of microcosm with their brand. And Santis aimed to do the same with ALD, except to represent his worldview based on his childhood, I suppose. and to incorporate all of the influences from New York's streetwear culture in the 90s. So he also says that the focus on his brand is not exactly on the clothes, even though they are a clothing brand, but it focuses more on the sense of nostalgia and the emotions that he tries to convey through his clothes, as well as what the brand represents, which would be, I guess, the New York street culture in the 90s. And this sort of philosophy really allows them to easily inject their essence into the different collaborations that they have, which I will of course touch on later. So this kind of mindset also really gives them a sense of authenticity, and I suppose it really helps them to relate to the target demographic, which will be New Yorkers who are looking for streetwear, especially given that it's something that they can relate to and something that will evoke a sense of nostalgia within them. So some ways where this influence can really be seen quite clearly would be in his store. He has some pairs of old Jordans that hang up by their shoelaces, and also on ALD's about page. It's actually a really brief page, but there is a link that says click here for more information. But when you click the link, it's actually a link to one of the Nas albums. So I think that also really shows the influence of music on ALD itself. So of course we talked about the New York side of Santis, but I also mentioned earlier that he was raised in a Greek household. So Santis used to spend summers in Greece with his grandparents, and I think his Greek heritage really shows through in his brand as well, but perhaps not as obviously as his New York heritage. So for example, in his flagship store, he actually has a cafe attached to it called Aime Leon Dore, which I've heard serves like Greek pastries and Greek coffee and all that. And in some of his pieces, he also uses some Greek imagery. So definitely not as strong of an influence as his New York side, but it's definitely still present. So now I'm going to be talking about the different ways that all these influences that I spoke about just now manifest themselves into ALD's offerings. So the first thing, which really isn't directly related to their clothes, but probably still influences them, would be this mood board that you can find on ALD's webpage. It's titled Leon Dore, and it's basically just a mood board, you know, a bunch of pictures. There's a lot of imagery of New York street culture from the 90s, as well as a lot of imagery from Greece. Another sort of way that these influences manifest themselves into ALD's clothing is the use of more vibrant colors and the use of color blocking in general. I believe back in the late 80s to early 90s, color was very popular in streetwear. So if you remember a few years ago, there was this trend to wear retro windbreakers from the late 80s to the early 90s. I remember those colors were really bright and vibrant, and that's something that we don't really see a lot of nowadays. So I believe that ALD's use of colors is definitely drawn from this era. And the last, and I think one of the main ways that these inspirations sort of show through in ALD's clothes will be the juxtaposition between casual wear and menswear. So Santis actually gave this quote in an interview. He said, "With us, you have this component where maybe a kid will come in and buy a white tee with a feliz blunt image. But then you have a guy who is a bit older who is buying a $1,000 coat." So if this sounds familiar, it's sort of similar to what Noah is doing. So for example, ALD has offerings like hoodies, sweatshirts, but they also have stuff like overcoats and penny loafers. While this is similar to what Noah does, I think the reason for doing this is very different to that of Noah's. So for ALD, I believe it's because of the strong influence of New York City as a whole on the brand. At least to me, New York seems to have this kind of weird duality. So of course, out of New York was born this sort of street culture that shaped how modern streetwear is today. You see brands like Supreme. But at the same time, you also think of Manhattan and the skyscrapers in Manhattan. You think of Wall Street and you think of men in suits. So perhaps ALD is trying to represent and cater to all different facets of New York. Lastly, this mix that ALD has could be influenced by Normie, which was a New York brand that was around from the mid to late 2000s. And they actually carried a mix of streetwear and high-end fashion stuff. So they were sort of the first to pioneer this kind of mix. And now you see a lot of boutiques carrying this kind of mix. And I guess ALD adopted the same sort of approach. One interesting fact about Normie is that they actually carried the first iteration of Noah. If you remember in last week's video, I talked about how Barradeen tried to start Noah back in 2002, but then it eventually failed. So it's quite interesting to see how New York sort of has their own ecosystem of streetwear. Now, the next thing I'm going to be talking about will be their collaborations. I think ALD does a lot of collaborations, and I think that's the way that most people would know about ALD. And I think talking about the collaboration is really a good way to once again showcase how ALD's influences come through in their offerings. So firstly, the most famous collaboration that everyone should know would be their collaborations with New Balance. So I think to date they've done 3 collaborations so far, and to me they've all been really beautiful. Obviously, they have a great use of color blocking and colors, because with most of New Balance's collaborations, they play around with the colors a lot, and ALD is no exception. But at the same time, in their New Balance collaborations, they also included a lot of apparel, and I don't really see that much with these sneaker collaborations. I suppose one exception would be the recent Casablanca collaboration with New Balance, But that was a pre-order thing, and it wasn't nearly as hyped as the ALD and New Balance apparel was. So once again, I suppose this showcases how ALD's authenticity allows them to inject the essence into pretty much anything. Now next, we won't really be able to say that ALD is a true New York brand if they didn't collaborate with Timberland. Well, I don't think I really need to explain to you guys the obvious ties between Timberland and New York street culture, but I think this collaboration was pretty interesting to see because I guess at least when I think of Timberland, I always think on either the brown or the light tan or the black colorways, and you don't really see these kinds of colors. Next, ALD collaborated with this brand called Drake's, and if I'm not mistaken, Drake's is actually a brand that's more associated with suiting and all that. So you wouldn't really expect a streetwear brand to collaborate with them. But this again showcases the mix in ALD's offerings, whereby they do offer more high-end stuff as well, or more formal stuff. Also within this collaboration, there are a lot of colors that are present, which once again shows how ALD has managed to inject their essence into the stuff that they put out, because you don't really think of a lot of bright colors when you think of these kind of more formal brands. Recently, they've also done a collaboration with Porsche. So they sort of restored this Porsche 911 if I'm not wrong, and they sort of decked out the interior of the car with different kinds of materials. I remember on the seats there's some houndstooth, and I think it's really cool, you know, because you don't often see a car being part of the collaboration. In the past few years, there has been some brands that collaborate with other supercar brands. I'm not gonna name names, but they don't really go the extra mile that ALD did with this collaboration and actually get in the car itself and collaborate on that. So I think that's really, really interesting and cool to see. And lastly, the collaborations with Kith. Now, Kith and ALD have collaborated numerous times over the past few years because, like I mentioned earlier, Ronnie Fag is actually friends with Santis. But I want to highlight one specific collaboration that they did, which was their 2017 collaboration. It was actually inspired by Mykonos, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, which is an island that's in Greece. So that also shows sort of Santis' Greek heritage coming through. Now, the last sort of design element that I want to talk about in a lot of ALD's offerings will be their use of the brand logo. Now, I know a lot of people are going to say, oh, you know, it's a streetwear brand using their logo, it's not a shock. But I think that ALD is slightly different in a way. Let me explain. So firstly, of course, their logo has sort of historical significance to the brand as a whole, because like I mentioned earlier, Ronnie Fag actually posted this plain sweatshirt that Santis screen printed the logo on back in 2012 on his Instagram, and that's how ALD initially gained a lot of traction and a lot of interest. But also ALD doesn't just use the same old plain logo, they also play around a lot with it. So they make use of different fonts, and sometimes they also use the logo and take it to form whole new like wacky designs like I'm going to showcase here. So it's not just slapping a logo on a plain sweatshirt, which of course they do, but they also make use of the logo to create whole new designs around them, which I think is quite interesting. Now next, I'm going to touch very briefly on some pieces from ALD that I quite like. So the first piece will be this knit jumper from the Fall/Winter 19 season, and ALD describes the color as Parmesan and purple. I guess I can see it, you know, why it would be called Parmesan. Well, I like this jumper because I really like to use color in my outfits, but sometimes I find it quite hard to pull off, especially because my skin is so pale. So I think it looks kind of weird if I use colors that are too bright. But I think the combination in this jumper is perfect because you have the neutral tones to tone down the vibrant purple that they use, and the combination of colors really plays off against each other and it helps them to pop a lot while still seeming cohesive and not very garish. Now next will be another knit jumper, which will be this Molyvos jumper. I once again hope I pronounced that right. So Molyvos is actually the old name of a town in Greece, and this is from the Spring/Summer 20 collection. Now this piece was really popular, I think because if you guys are familiar with the Instagram account Hidden NY, they reposted it. So it sold out really fast, and now on Grailed they're reselling for like twice or 3 times the amount. So that's pretty crazy. But this piece does showcase Santis' Greek heritage. I'm a fan of this jumper because I like how they use this combination of colors to represent the graphic. Now, the colors aren't really super true to life because if you look at like clear skies in Greece, I think that the blue is a lot more vibrant, a lot more light, but you sort of intuitively know what it's meant to represent. So I think that shows that the graphic itself is quite well done. And I love the detail in the sweater that is brought about by the intarsia technique that they used in it. Now the next thing I like to talk about isn't really a specific piece, but it's more of an entire collection. And that will be ALD's recent collab with New Balance, more specifically on the 827 model. Personally, I wasn't really a fan of the shoe model itself, but I think the collection as a whole was really cool because it managed to capture these really retro vibes. I know vibes isn't a very descriptive or scientific word, but if you look at the collection, you really know what I mean. I think that the use of colors and the color blocking really helped to capture this vibe pretty well. And I think that the graphics were nice and simple and they weren't too loud, but they also somehow managed to capture this really retro vibe, which I enjoyed a lot. And the last thing I like to highlight will be the ALD pennies. I think I mentioned this in my last video, but I recently started to get interested in alternative footwear, things like boots, things like penny loafers. I think that ALD's offerings for penny loafers would be more appealing to the streetwear crowd because they come in a variety of colors and it's not just your typical like black or brown that people associate with penny loafers and people might find boring. So I suppose it really helps to push the mix between streetwear and more formal style, which I'm all for. And now I'm going to go into my overall thoughts about ALD as a whole. Now firstly, I really like the use of colors. I talked about why I love colors so much in my first video about Casablanca, so you can watch that here. But I like how ALD managed to do this by incorporating the colors into simple silhouettes. A lot of times when I see companies try to do a lot of crazy colors, they tend to overdo it because the silhouette is very loud as well. So the combination of the silhouette and the colors make it a little bit unwearable. Also, like I mentioned earlier, a lot of times when companies do these very bright colors or very loud colors, I don't think I can wear it really well because, like I said, I have very pale skin, so it looks kind of weird on me. And I appreciate that with ALD's color blocking offerings, they sort of tend to do different options, and the different options almost convey different moods. So there's really a choice for everyone there. So for example, a lot of times they have a very bold option and they have an option that's a little bit more muted and much more wearable. So I do appreciate that. Next, I really like the contrast between the streetwear side and the dressy side of the offerings. I talked about this in more detail in my Noah video, so I'm not gonna go over it again, but you can watch it over here. Lastly, I think I find ALD pretty interesting as a brand because it gives me, an outsider, sort of an insight into what New York street culture is like, and especially what it was like back in the 90s. I think for me personally, I've been more exposed to the LA side of streetwear and street culture in the US, especially because I've lived in Singapore for most of my life. So the weather is a lot more similar to LA, where it's a lot more hot. So for example, there's a lot more of an emphasis on things like oversized tees, vintage tees, like ripped denim, and not so much of an emphasis on things like outerwear or like boots. So it really helps me to broaden my horizons, and this is especially useful for me now because I study in the UK, if you guys weren't aware. Obviously in the UK, the weather's a lot colder, so I can start to incorporate a lot more outerwear, a lot of these influences into my personal wardrobe. Now for my thoughts on ALD as a whole overall, I think that some of their stuff is a little bit too logo heavy for me. I personally find their knits and their collaborations the things that interest me the most. So in the future, if I do decide to purchase from ALD, I'll probably gravitate towards that side of ALD. And I guess that brings us to the end of the video. Now I'm sorry that today's video was a little bit short, but personally I didn't really think there was that much to talk about with ALD. But let me know your thoughts on ALD in the comments below. And if you liked the video, please make sure you leave a like. It really helps out the channel. And if you want to watch more of this kind of content in the future, make sure you hit the subscribe button down below. But until then, see you guys and peace out.